today I wanted to talk about the new album by The Church, who I haven't covered much on this channel, but who've been one of my favorite bands for most of my adult life. And, they're a great band for an obsessive CD collector, right? They have this huge, sprawling discography, much of which was never really accessible on vinyl. They have quite a lot of oddities and B-sides, rare tracks, things like that, most of which are not common, but not so difficult to get that they're going to break the budget, right? And their sound reveals unexpected depths the longer that you live in it. The songs aren't flashy at all, but the parts of the arrangement tend to fit together in really smart, unexpected ways that really reveal depth and creativity the longer that you live with them. And the lyrics are cinematic and surreal, and then also built around a surprising amount of cleverness and emotional depth. And, sonically and lyrically, I think they're one of the great world-building bands, right? And that's kind of a way that they overlap somewhat with the prog rock bands, even though, they're only partially influenced by progressive music. So I wanted to talk about the state of the church generally, and, my thoughts about their recent history. And then I'm also going to talk about, like I mentioned earlier, the new album, The Hypnogogue, which came out February 24. And, I have to admit an opinion here, which I think might be unpopular because it's not something that I see expressed often in forums where the church are being discussed. But, I think that it's possible to like The Hypnogogue. It's possible to be moved by it, to be glad that it exists. And at the same time, to kind of think that maybe it's too bad that we're now defining the church as Steve Kilbey and whatever group of people he happens to be able to assemble. Now, I think the history of the church is inspiring, partly because they survived a lot of the things that kill most bands who go through equivalent experiences, right? They're mainly known in the US as a one-hit wonder based on the success of their song Under the Milky Way. And, in the fallout of that song, they survived rapid commercial success followed by rapid commercial decline. They survived ejection from the major label system. They survived a decade of heroin addiction by lead singer Steve Kilbey. And, they not only continued through those things, which would kill almost any band, but they found a new equilibrium where they were an intensely prolific and beloved cult act. And I love everything they've done, but there's something particularly impressive about the run between when guitarist Peter Koppes returned in about 1998 and the departure of guitarist Marty Wilson Piper in 2015, right? The stretch roughly from the album Hologram of Ball through Untitled number 23. In those years, they're putting out an album every 2 or 3 years. Every album that they do is imaginative and adds something distinct to their catalog. And every album cycle, they basically have a whole second album kind of emerge from the same sessions that stands as kind of a stranger, more digressive mirror of the main album. In most cases, there are also a few additional B-sides, and then things like their acoustic albums that further kind of bolster their catalog. And again, all that is great on its own terms, but it's even more impressive from the standpoint of this being a band that very nearly got chewed up by the things that chew up most bands that have some brush with success. Now, if you're watching this video, you probably know all this. You probably know that guitarist Marty Wilson Piper left the band in 2014. Guitarist Peter Koppes left about 5 years later. They've been replaced by the guitarists Ian Hogue and Ashley Naylor, and that the current lineup is also bolstered by Jeffrey Kane, who was in the project Isidore with Steve Kilbey. To be fair, Isidore is really quite excellent, and I love both the albums that came out under that project. But this is the first album with neither Marty nor Peter, right? The guitar duo who really kind of drove the instrumental sound of the church for nearly all of their career, with a few exceptions that I'll get into in a bit. And I have to admit that, in the 10 years since that kind of core guitar duo was broken up, something significant, I think, has been lost. And you can see that in the recorded output, right? Which has been slimmer and frankly less impressive. After Untitled number 23, it takes 5 years to get the album Further Deeper. which I do like a lot, right? That album is very dynamic. It has some cool moods. The songs really lend themselves well to live performance. But I have found over time that, sustained attention has revealed maybe less sonic lyrical depth than most of their best work. And then 3 years later, we get the follow-up, Man, Woman, Life, Death, Infinity, with its absurdly overambitious title attached to kind of a slight, underwhelming 10-song set with kind of a hazy sound that hides a lack of really defined instrumental writing and lyrics that often kind of cross the line from evocatively free associative into just sort of nonsense or rambling. And at the same time, those album cycles around Further, Deeper, Life, Death, Man, Woman, Infinity, those don't have the same kind of great flood of B-sides or alternate takes or other interesting miscellanea that the classic period did, right? And I think that slowing in the kind of prolific output is really a key to the sense of decline. The old lineup made prodigious quantities of great music. The post-Marty lineup makes smaller quantities of less impressive music. Now, the Church have spent the last 35 years or so of their existence as an underdog cult band, right? And they have overcome a huge amount. And one result of that seems to be that people are kind of reluctant to be too critical of them in a public forum. The only people who are really paying attention to them at this point are devoted fans who are very much on their side. And so, one-on-one conversations with other fans, I hear a lot of people express some doubt about the quality of the last couple albums, but then people kind of seem often reluctant to express that in public. Now, I totally understand why Kilby would keep the name The Church going through an era of decline, through, the changing of a membership that had been mostly incredibly stable up until then. I'd probably do the same thing in his position, right? It's his most visible and commercially viable project. It's the one that by far goes the most toward defining his legacy. It would be a lot to give up, even for as prolific as he is with other sorts of acts. And his personality and lyrical style and vocal style have always been strong enough as a defining feature of the Church that it's understandable why he would take the position that it is the defining feature. So I've lived with the Hypnogogue for about a week now. I've listened to it at least once a day throughout that time. 2 impressions that have come out of that immersion. The first impression is that there's some ineffable way in which it really just doesn't quite feel like the Church, right? There's a flavor that came from Marty and Peter's writing and playing that's missing, and that's more about a sense of voice and personality than it is about any kind of objectively definable stylistic trait. If you listen to the album Jammed, you can get a sense of what the writing process was like during the classic years as the end of the song Interlock on the Jammed album actually kind of shows the beginning of the song Real Toggle Action emerging in real time from improvisation, right? Like that is the construction of a lot of the classic music. And, missing 2 of the 4 people who generated that is going to have a change in a kind of a spiritual and flavor sort of way, even if the style is kind of carefully kept along the same lines. Probably the closest comparison I would make here stylistically to older Church would be After Everything, Now This, right? In that both albums are a lot more based on synth and keys and ambiance. So it's not that it doesn't sound like the Church, because it doesn't sound like any other Church album in the sense that it's like not based on interlocking guitar lines or something like that, right? Some great Church work has been done outside of that technique. It just has the soul of a different project. Second impression, though, is it's actually a really good album. Stylistically, it has some of the haziness of Man, Woman, Life, Death, Infinity, some of that soundscapey quality where it's a lot more about mood and texture than about clearly definable riffs or distinct instrumental ideas, and that leaves a lot of emphasis on vocal lines. And I had some of the same thoughts, actually, about Man, Woman, Life, Death, Infinity, that it kind of didn't feel like the Church in a certain way. But the quality of the writing here around those vocal lines is much, much better, right? There are lots of catchy, memorable, well-composed vocal parts. Kilby's really in top form here as a vocal writer. And when identifiable riffs do emerge, which they do in a number of places, they tend to be simple, smart, catchy. Again, definitely a step up in terms of writing quality, really maybe even relative to the last two albums, certainly relative to the last one. And there are quite a lot of different sounds and textures and hints of different styles being incorporated while still feeling unified in mood and presentation. Now, as far as the quality of the lyrics, it always takes a little bit of time with Kilby to kind of tell the difference between the brilliant stuff and the tossed off horse shit. But only a few lines here really stick out as clunky, and there's a lot of compelling imagery and interesting kind of lyrical bits. I haven't really fit it all together yet. It's supposed to be a concept album, and I'm not necessarily sold on the idea that is happening, really. I haven't really put it all together yet, and I'm not sold on the idea that it has much kind of consistency as a concept album, despite what Kilby says. But at a first impression, it really seems to be much stronger, more consistent, more thoughtful lyric writing than a lot of what he's done in other projects in the last decade or so. And time will tell that for sure. And this is also an album with a pretty impressive and well thought out sense of sequencing and pace. It has some length, it has some heft, it covers some ground. It opens with a piece that feels very epic. It has a pretty good sense of balance between louder songs and shorter, smaller ones. And the closing track, Second Bridge, is one of the better closing tracks they've had in a while. A really powerful piece with a great sense of build-up, more effective to me than the closing Miami from Further Deeper, which a lot of people really enjoy, but really, I don't know, doesn't achieve for me the kind of sense of scale and power that it wants to. At the same time, though, there's a sense of frailty here that feels new, right? The music of the church has always had a yearning quality, right? And a tinge of elliptically expressed sadness. And that's really, actually, I think, a lot of what's made it endure for me. But Kilby in particular just kind of feels tired and exhausted and melancholy here in a way that he hasn't quite before. The timbre of his voice started to change around the time of Further Deeper. Initially, that change was more noticeable live, but it's really become clear on record now too. His voice has this kind of fragile, cracked quality to it that honestly has taken some getting used to. It happens with aging, right? But his voice has basically, he sounded like he was 25 until he was in his 50s, and then something kind of hit him in a very sudden way right around 2014. But on this album, I think the tone of the lyrics and the melodies is kind of adapted to that new sound that his voice has in a way that makes everything fit together more effectively and kind of lines things up in a way that maybe it wasn't on the last couple albums. Now, it's not perfect. There are a couple of clunky lyrics spread here and there. I particularly dislike, off the top of my head, the couplet, the luckiest shot, the suckiest plot, in the song Albert Ross, which is otherwise quite moving. The song C'est la vie feels a little bit kind of smarmy and wise-ass in a way that I don't love. Antarctica is a little bit meandering and dull, and the second half of that song is one of the few times that I would say that a Kilby project is weird in a bad way. But those are minor missteps, and I think they partly come from a willingness to take chances and cover a broad stretch of ground. So even though I'm still ambivalent about the fact that this is coming out as The Church, even though I still miss the Marty Peter lineup and probably always will, at the same time, taken on its own terms, this is a moody, atmospheric rock album with some elements of ambient, psychedelic, prog rock, and it's very well written, I think, in a way that will probably stand up to repeated listenings over time. Now, it may be that the low expectations are causing me to underrate it a little bit. It may be that the low expectations are causing me to overrate it. I don't know for sure. But from living with it for a bit, it's a surprisingly strong work that I'm really glad I gave a chance to. And, I'd recommend it to anyone who has mixed feelings about the last couple Church albums, or some of the same mixed feelings that I do about the fact that the band has continued to go on even despite some lineup changes that have removed some of the things that were maybe core to the soul of the old church. Anyway, thanks very much for your time. I'd be interested in hearing other people's thoughts about the Hypnagogue and other people's thoughts about the changes that have come in the band recently. I hope everybody has a good day, and I will see you in a week.